Hello, good morning or good evening, depending on where in the world you are right now. My name is Milit Tibrahana Mescal. I'm a human rights activist, a journalist, a Tigrayan who's been impacted by the genocide in Tigray over the past few years. I've lost 15 family members that I know of so far. I traveled to Sudan with Tigray Media House to interview refugees shortly after the war began. The goal of today's discussion is to focus on transitional justice mechanisms and how we can center the voice of survivors of the Tigray genocide. Our mutual goal today is to ensure that those individuals have access to justice, because as we all know, if there is no justice, there will be revenge. It is in everyone's interest, regardless of which side of the pond you live on, to ensure that there's justice and accountability in Tigray and in Ethiopia. Today's guests are internationally known human rights champions, thought leaders, experts, authors, and so much more. They have not shied away from shining a light on the Tigray genocide, and we are honored to have them all with us for this conversation. I would like to thank the Tigray Diaspora Council in Europe for making this discussion possible. They do this monthly, and I believe this is the seventh conversation so far. So please make sure and support them and all of their efforts. Without further ado, we will begin our conversation. And our first guest today will be Professor Alex de Waal. I am going to read just a short bio. He needs no introduction. He is someone we all know very, very well, but I do want to just give you a little bit of information on his background. Professor Alex de Waal is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation, considered one of the foremost experts on Sudan and the Horn of Africa. His scholarly work and practice has also probed humanitarian crisis and response, human rights, HIV/AIDS, and governance in Africa, and conflict and peace building. His latest book, Mass Starvation: The History and Future of Famine, was published in 2017. He is also the author of The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa and so many more publications. Following a fellowship with the Global Equity Initiative at Harvard, he worked with the Social Science Research Council as director of the program on HIV and AIDS and social transformation, and led projects on conflict and humanitarian crises in Africa. During 2005 to 2006, de Waal was seconded to the African Union mediation team for Darfur, and from 2009 to 2011, he served as senior advisor to the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel for Sudan, where he took on a number of roles in the negotiations leading to the independence of South Sudan. He was on the list of Foreign Policy's 100 most influential public intellectuals in 2008, and Atlantic Monthly's 27 Brave Thinkers in 2009. It's a privilege to have you with us. Alex, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you are. And first of all, as I am speaking to a Tigrayan group, I want to offer my condolences to all of you for all those who you have lost during the last years. And I know that the grief and the pain is not lessened with the passing of time. Too many people have needlessly been lost to war, to famine, to massacre, to repression. And sadly, even now, also others are taking their own lives, unable to contemplate really what the future holds with all the pain and trauma that they have been going through, because it is not over. As communications and connections are restored, the realities of what has happened over the last few years only now begin to surface. And I think each time they do so, there is a new rawness, often an unexpected rawness in confronting these realities. And the traumas, sadly, will continue. There are tens of thousands with the physical scars of what they have been through. There are even larger numbers with the mental scars. There are the survivors of sexual abuse who will never be able to live the lives that they had rightfully anticipated for themselves. There are children whose life experience, even in their few years on this earth, has been included terror, hardship, witnessing pain and humiliation inflicted on their siblings, their parents, that no one of tender years should ever have to face. And of course, there are children born of rape, children who are themselves innocent, who are children of the state, children fathered by the state in Ethiopia, or indeed the state in Eritrea, brought into being against the wishes of their mothers, unwanted by their communities, their very presence a reminder of the most painful episodes that their mothers and perhaps their siblings underwent in their lifetimes, who are disavowed by the state that fathered them. And these children, what future they hold, I really don't know where to begin. Everyday living reminders of crimes beyond words. And yet, at a political level today, it's as though this never happened. The aftermath of the Pretoria Permanent Ceasefire Agreement is, it seems, a consensus or a conspiracy to say this didn't happen or it didn't matter. And so I want to spend just a few minutes reflecting on denialism as a phenomenon. And here I draw your attention to a wonderful book by a classic scholar, Stanley Cohen. It's this book, States of Denial. And if you don't have it, I really implore you, if you want to read one book about the legacy of denialism, the legacy of how the denial of mass atrocity, beginning with the Holocaust, how it unfolded and what it means, this is the book to read. And it speaks to me also in my own family, my own father, who was expelled from Austria by the Nazis in 1938, stripped of his nationality, and was restored to Austrian nationality only a few years ago, knowing what that meant to him, and how and the fact that more than 80 years on, this is still a live issue amongst the survivors of his generation, reminds me how this is something that will live on through the generations of survivors in Tigray. So Stan Cohen talks about several important techniques of denialism, and they're all occurring and have occurred and are continuing to occur in Ethiopia, and among Ethiopians, Eritreans, and the colluders in this crime. They're continuing to occur today. So he talks about literal denial, just the denial that it ever happened directly, which happens. But there's a more insidious version, which is just seeding doubts in the minds of the listeners that, what can you believe? So setting up, for example, this is a classic that is used by fossil fuel companies, by the tobacco companies. You will have experts who have established beyond reasonable doubt that climate change is happening or that tobacco is harmful. And then you get a crank or a paid hack, a hired hand for the industry, who is brought on as a balancing to these cranks, to these experts. And by putting them alongside one another, the audience or the reader goes away with the impression that facts and analysis are the subject of legitimate dispute. And that is the basis of denialism. And that's what we have as a particular technique of sowing doubt and uncertainty pursued in the post-truth era by the advocates of the populist, polarizing post-truth government that we have in Addis Ababa. And secondly, we have interpretive denial, which is to say, something happened, but it was really something else. They change the subject. They say this was a Western conspiracy. This was a proxy battle space. This was an attempt to discredit the worthy aims of a reformist government, to revive something from the past, something that might be on, and they seem to be able to behave, to believe contradictions at the same time. This was a Marxist-Leninist movement, i.e. TPLF, beloved of the Western powers, the United States. However, those things may be contradictory, yet that contradiction and obvious error is not an obstacle to promoting denialism among such people. And then there's implicatoria denial, which is to argue it was justified. What happened was justified in the greater cause of saving this great Ethiopian nation, or the other side started it, or both sides committed atrocities, and therefore we have no reason to investigate the ones that our side committed, or accusing those who bring the report of having biases themselves. And there may be elements of truth in all of these things. It may be true that the Tigrayan leadership was not innocent in the start of the war, that it committed atrocities too, that not all those who are reporting on what happened are unbiased, and yet none of that takes away from the objective reality of what happened, the appalling abuses that were inflicted. So let me move on briefly to the what is contained in the Pretoria Permanent Ceasefire Agreement with reference to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which was adopted in 2019. Now, what we know is that in the negotiations in Pretoria, it was the South African member of the mediation panel, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Luka, who insisted that reference be made to the victims and survivors and to transitional justice. Otherwise, it would not have been in there. And there are a couple of very interesting things that I want to just reference in this document. The first is that it has an obvious major flaw, which is in the principles, paragraph 23. It says the principles are based on the rationale for the transitional justice policy that must address the root causes of conflict and contribute to the creation of sustainable peace, accountability, social justice, and transformative democratic and socio-economic reform. And then the first principle is African leadership. This principle is critical, and I'm reading, to ensure that the priorities and oversight of the implementation of the TJ process remain the responsibility of African governments, and that other stakeholders should respect this leadership. Now, nowhere in this document does it actually say that African principles should defer to or should be in conformity with universal human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other United Nations principles. And this is a key failing, because if the African Union should fail, and we have many reasons for fearing that it will, it gives no recourse. So this is a key point that needs to be borne in mind, and it is contrary to the constitutive act of the African Union, which does enshrine those universal principles, and indeed a whole host of other commitments undertaken, which are overriding commitments. They are not optional, they are overriding obligations on African states to observe universal human rights principles, norms, conventions, etc., including in its own African charter and so on. But the other interesting point that I want to make is that it includes within it, in paragraph 6, reference to the African Union panel on Darfur, of which I was an advisor during 2009. And I think this is interesting because the AU panel on Darfur was actually a very worthwhile exemplar, and it's cited as such in this policy, although the implications are not drawn out. And the reason why it's interesting is that the three African former heads of state who comprised the panel, that is Thabo Mbeki, Abdusalam Abubakar, and Pierre Buyoya, they made 3 trips to Darfur. And in the first one, they drew up their terms of reference in consultation with people whom they engaged with in Darfur. And their terms of reference were, they said, we want to address 4 things: justice, reconciliation, peace, and Darfur's position within Sudan as a whole. So issues of democracy, governance of diversity, etc., etc. But more importantly, they said, the people who we have not heard from in, at that time, 6 years of international debate on Darfur, the people we have not heard from are the people of Darfur. So we will go and talk to them. So on the second visit, the panel held 40 days, full days of town hall style meetings with a diverse group of people of Darfur from all walks of life, including in areas where the government of Sudan could not go. So some IDP camps, some rebel-held areas. And they had a diversity of opinions, a range of opinions, a lot of people very enraged, full of hurt and grievance, etc., addressing these 4 issues and seeking to see how solutions could be found. And the panel then went away, drafted its recommendations, and went back a 3rd time to meet with representatives of all the communities to say, is this what you want? And having got that report validated, then that became the policy of the African Union, although the African Union didn't follow through, unfortunately. But that is the sort of process that is an African process, an African solution, as envisaged by those 3 African former heads of state. And it's the sort of thing that I think we should fasten upon as we are contemplating transitional justice processes for Tigray. And I just want to conclude with a couple of remarks on some of the issues that should arise and should be under debate, which I think are often neglected, which are transitional justice processes for starvation crimes, an issue that I have been championing in particular. And this is particularly important because there are material obligations that arise in a transitional justice context for starvation crimes, which are material restitution of objects that have been destroyed or rendered useless, compensation for the victims and survivors, reparations. And there's leverage here with aid donors. Why should it be, for example, that in the rehabilitation of Tigray's infrastructure, its medical services, its water supplies, its agriculture, and much of the financing of this will fall on international donors? Why is it that international donors should end up paying for infrastructure that was built with aid money and was then stolen or destroyed by the Ethiopian authorities or the Eritrean authorities? Should that not be the responsibility of those authorities that stole or destroyed those resources? This may not be the highest priority for transitional justice, but it is an issue over which the international community has most leverage. But I want to conclude with the last point, which is that for those who have suffered the humiliations, the indignities, the traumas of starvation, what they often come away with is not an awareness that this was a crime inflicted upon them, but the memory of the many cruelties and indignities they suffered and had to inflict. They will recall the way they couldn't share their food with their starving neighbors, the way they had to turn away their hungry members of their own community from their own door, the long-held prized assets that they had to forfeit, that they had to sell, maybe land or jewelry inherited from grandmothers. The fact that they could provide medication for this child, but not for that child. And it is an important act of recognition and emancipation to recognize the crime, to say, this was not your fault. This was something inflicted upon you by an authority, a power outside, and you are innocent of these humiliations. You should respect, you should be able to go on with the rest of your life with the dignity of knowing you are a survivor rather than a perpetrator of these atrocities in what Primo Levi, in his great book on survival in Auschwitz, called the gray zone. And Primo Levi was never able himself to come to terms with those cruelties that he himself felt he had participated in. And years later, out of despair, that was the lack of recognition of that was something that caused him to take his own life very sadly. So I think at this stage, really our most important thing is to extend our recognition, our sympathy, our dignity and solidarity to the survivors of these crimes beyond words. Thank you.
Wow, Alex, thank you. So many things come up, so many questions, so much. Something really powerful that you said about the survivors, especially of starvation, and helping them understand that they are innocent and this was inflicted upon them. You know, in the genocide, you know how genocide begins. It's by degrading a people and making them, you know, feel less than. But one of the terms that was always used was that, well, Tigrayans have never been able to feed themselves. They've always been a starving people. There are these terms that have consistently come up, and so it's interesting. Your framing of that is really interesting. My question, I just have one question for you because I know we have to move on to our next panelist. But my question is, in this culture of denialism, how do we build a transitional justice system when the people in charge deny that the crimes have even occurred or even happened? And I'm also really intrigued by what you said about Darfur in terms of the people. The process or the framework was validated by the people. There's a feeling by the people of Tigray that they've been left out of this process. And so can you say a little bit about, you know, about those two things in terms of how do people who deny what's happened, how do we get to justice when they're the ones who are in charge?
I think what is clear and what has become clear in the months since Pretoria is that political leadership for whatever reason, cannot be entrusted with this process. The process has to come from the people themselves, from the grassroots, and the responsibilities for this kind of action lie with the communities in Tigray and the communities of solidarity abroad around the world. It is our collective responsibility to take this forward in terms of documentation, in terms of extending essential services, in terms of expressing those essential sentiments of solidarity and empowerment. This is not a process that can be left at a high political level. And it may be that the process will take many years to come to fruition, but that is something that we need to face.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your expertise and your unwavering commitment to human rights and the people of Tigray. I mean, we're truly forever indebted. Thank you so much for your time. Our next speaker is Professor, and forgive me, my name is always pronounced wrong, so I'm sure I will pronounce your name wrong, Professor Kjetil Tronvall. So please correct me when you take the mic. Professor Tronvall is the director of Oslo Analytica, as well as professor and research director of Peace and Conflict Studies at Oslo New University College. Professor Tronvall was professor of human rights at the University of Oslo until 2010 and former co-founding partner of International Law and Policy Institute, an international advisory company. His doctoral degree is in political anthropology from London School of Economics and Political Science. Additionally, Professor Tronvall has a Master's of Philosophy research degree from the University of Oslo. He has broad experience with governance, politics, conflict, peace and reconciliation, and human rights related issues, as well as in-depth experience in African studies. Professor Tronval is a peace and conflict studies researcher specializing in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Zanzibar. He's certainly no stranger to the issues in Ethiopia and in Tigray. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And you pronounced my name quite good, actually. So I'm happy with that. Thank you so much for inviting me, and salam to everyone wherever you are, and whichever time zone you are in. And let me also, of course, follow and say my full support to Alex's condolences and the way he expressed it to the Tigrayan people at large in Tigray, in Ethiopia, and wherever you are spread in the world as a consequence of this conflict and former conflicts. Our hearts are with you and has been with you all the time. And I am very grateful, but also a bit hesitant of being asked to talk about transitional justice in Tigray and Ethiopia in the aftermath of the war. I have used quite some time for the last months to think about it and how to approach it, and also how to have a, what can I say, academic opinion on it. And it's not that easy, I must say. The war itself and the process in the aftermath raises some serious challenges towards how to approach transitional justice and accountability. The context in Tigray, in Ethiopia, in Amhara region, and in Eritrea are still fraught with ambiguity and uncertainty, making any transitional justice process insecure and problematic, no matter how we approach it. It is not akin to the situation we faced after the fall of the Derg, when the EPRDF took power and you had a clear victor's position on the political landscape of the country, and also a position which dictated the transitional justice process at that time, the so-called Red Terror trials, which I spent 3-4 years of studying and authored a book on that, edited a book. Has it only been that kind of clear cut, so to say? We could have had a much more firm position on how to go about to think about and design a transitional justice process in Ethiopia. So I'm going to raise 3 points only, and to make my time rather brief so we can open for discussions later on. It's the widespread, systematic and massive scale of the atrocities, the deliberate targeting of the civilian population and the infrastructure, the use of famine and ethnic cleansing as strategies of war, will, taken both separately and together, necessitate a comprehensive transitional justice mechanism, no doubt about that. And as a professor of human rights, I would thus argue the imperative for a juridical retributive justice to be meted out on all those accountable, from the rank and file soldiers to the top military and political leadership through the chain of command. They should not go with impunity for the massive atrocities being committed. However, and it is a big however, the way the war was concluded and the formulations in the Pretoria Agreement on lasting peace through the cessation of hostilities point to the understanding that this was an agreement of military capitulation by the Tigrayan forces due to the lack of supplies and resources, both for its army and the civilian population, which had been under humanitarian blockade for a long time. The alleged perpetrators of the mass atrocities are thus still in power and will determine the framework and context of a transitional justice process. And, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, so far in history, as far as I know, no victor has voluntarily put himself and his troops up for trial for mass atrocities. Why should this happen in Ethiopia? So, as a professor of peace and conflict studies and politics, I would thus argue differently than as a professor of human rights, and rather seek out what political space is it at all possible to carve out, if at all any, to look into a broader aspect of accountability for the atrocity committed, not only retributive juridical accountability. And make no mistake about it, the transitional justice process in Ethiopia will not be ruled by legalistic parameters outlined in international humanitarian law and international human rights law. A transitional justice process in Ethiopia will be dictated by a strict set of political parameters defined by the ruling elite. That is clear. So the question Tigray and the Tigrayans should ask themselves are, what is your normative objectives with the transitional justice process? Are these objectives obtainable considering the current political process and context in the country? And if not, what are the minimal normative objectives you can obtain, considering who is in power? In such a process of deliberation, you might end up with a minuscule set of juridical accountability standards for the atrocities. Maybe some rank and file soldiers, maybe some junior officers will be charged only. Whereas the command responsibility principle, making the top military leadership and the political elites accountable, will most likely not happen. That principle will be abandoned, and the elites will go away with impunity. If so, the despairing question you need to ask yourself is, will even a minuscule juridical accountability of the atrocities perpetrated actually do more harm than good? If Tigray condones a transitional justice process where the Ethiopian, Eritrean, Amhara military and political leadership are not implicated, it will be understood as an implicit acceptance of impunity for these elites. Hence, maybe it is better to discard any kind of juridical retributive justice from the start in order to avoid such false and easily manipulative scenarios to come to the surface. That is a serious, challenging position, obviously, to take, but you need to take it now, before the process starts, and before the manipulation starts of these standards, of this context, of the parameters. But a transitional justice process is by nature broad and multifaceted. Parallel to a legalistic framework, you will also have a broader political elements of transitional justice. The Tigrayan constituency thus should also ask themselves what kind of political objectives you aim to achieve through a transitional justice process. How should you go about to fulfill those political objectives? It can be restorative justice, reparations, compensations, political guarantees, territorial guarantees, and so on and so forth, are all relevant issues to discuss and to formulate policy options on, to be included or not in a transitional justice process. Within this field of transitional justice, there will be more room to negotiate solutions which might bring more concrete benefits than harm to the Tigrayan society. As you see, I'm trying to mitigate expectations, basically, to all, as a transitional justice process will be conducted on the victor's premises. Yes, that is not fair, but politics seldom are. This should by no means be interpreted as I'm belittling or ignoring the massive atrocities and sufferings endured by the Tigrayan people. And my last point will be in that regard, that no matter what kind of transitional justice mechanism will be designed by the federal authorities, it is imperative for the Tigrayan community to undertake its own thorough investigation, documentation, and memorialization of the 2-year war and its impact in Tigray and its society at large. This document should not be framed in a revengeful narrative against your former enemies, but as a reminder to current and future generations that political leadership, on no matter which side of the war front, needs to be held accountable to the people. Should be a reminder for the future generations of Tigrayans that your political leaders need to have the people's best interest in mind and need to be politically accountable for their mistakes. And that is a process you, as Tigrayans, can and should decide on yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You said something that I had like a guttural reaction to, and so I want to repeat it and then ask you to clarify, because I think that you're pulling a curtain back that many of us don't want to look behind, and it's this idea of mitigating expectations. Did I hear you correctly, or do I infer correctly that you're saying, of course we want transitional justice, but we should rethink that process if ultimately it's being manipulated and will lead to impunity? That's what I heard, but I just want to, because that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of us who really, you know, who were directly impacted and indirectly impacted. I mean, the idea that we won't get justice in this process, which is more and more apparent if we're being honest, is what you're saying, is that we should take a step back and perhaps rethink what justice looks like. I'm curious about that. And then also, what can we do to sort of strengthen transitional justice mechanisms if we can actually get there? Or yeah, I think you left me a little bit speechless. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, and that was not my intention, but you interpret me correctly. I think what you should keep in mind that a transitional justice process can do more harm than good. It's politics. And should you take part in a process which actually might condone impunity for those who are responsible, isn't then better to take a step back and say, well, this is a process we cannot engage in because we don't agree with the fundamental principles of it. And already you see in the so-called position paper by the Minister of Justice in Ethiopia, what will come out, what kind of framework it is aimed to design for the transitional process. I'm not saying that you should accept, but I'm saying that be careful on what you are willing to contribute to. And have a long-term perspective, as Alex hinted at, and see what kind of opportunities might arise again later on. You have also some international jurisdiction. You have certain countries looking into pursuing a bilateral process of accountability under their national framework of law, so to say. You should think more creatively on that than only, because I'm sorry, I'm a realist. I don't see anything coming out of the domestic process in terms of juridical retributive justice. I see that there might be possibilities on the more broader landscape of political objectives as such, where it might be more easy for Tigray to obtain and to fulfill some of the objectives you might have. I'm sorry that I left you speechless, but I'm very blunt. I'm not a diplomat, as you can see. I just say, based on all we know of transitional justice mechanism, as long as the victor is in power, it will not happen.
Wow. No, I thank you for your honesty and your take. That's why we invited you here. One thing that you also said that I think we don't focus on enough, and there are efforts to do this, but the idea of making sure that we document and preserve as much evidence as we can to move forward, because, you know, perhaps we won't get justice in the short term, but I do believe eventually there's hope for some of that. But if nothing else, just to document. I think a lot of people who really study, as you all do, the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia, and even what's happened in Tigray, you know, this is not the first time this has happened. And there was a culture of, we don't talk about it, we move on, we survived it, and you just keep going forward. And so what we've learned now is, if we don't tell our story, someone else will. And unfortunately, the story will likely not be favorable to you, so or even accurate to you. So I think that is some good advice. Wow. I'm sure I look a little shell shocked. That was a tough conversation, if I'm being honest, as someone who is, very passionate about justice and that process and eventually getting there. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sarah Vaughan. Vahan. You'll have to correct me. I'm sorry. I know I'm pronouncing your name right.
You were perfect first time.
Vahan. Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you. Dr. Sarah Vaughan has worked in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa since the late 1980s, advising a series of governmental, multilateral, academic, and non-governmental bodies. An honorary fellow of the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh from 2001 to 2021, she has taught African politics and social theory in Scotland and Ethiopia. Her research and consulting experience and publications cover a broad range of factors shaping the political economy of the region: longitudinal change in rural development, gender, power, and policymaking, the deployment of state and natural resources, economic rents and networks, land and pastoralism, and the politicization, of ethnicity, conflict and security sector policy and capacity, and strategies of conflict transformation, nationalist, religious, and transnational influences on political competition or insurgency, federal multi-level governance, public and private sector economic and service delivery roles in African developmental states, the interaction of new institutions of democratization with wider socio-political cultures, party-state society relations, especially regarding post-Marxist and transitional justice dynamics, and the rule of law. Dr. Vaughan is also interested in the theorization of power and interaction and interest in political status group formation, and in research methods, policy, and ethics in contested or polarized political environments. She has adaptable skills in research design, program management, policy making advice, and liaison, and can work in Amharic, which is amazing. Amongst others, she's the co-author of The Culture of Power in Contemporary Ethiopia Political Life, Changing Rural Ethiopia, Community Transformations, and Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War, which recently came out in 2023. I just got my copy and I look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Vaughan. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Melite, and thanks for having me on this very interesting panel. I'm particularly pleased to be speaking after Shetil, because he and I have argued about this stuff for at least 3 decades now, I think. And certainly worked together on the book that he edited on the special prosecutions of the Derg. I worked as an advisor to the special prosecutor in the 1990s, and I'm a little bit more sanguine about prosecutions than Shetil is, but this is an argument that we've been having for a long time, and I'm sure we'll go on having it. So I think I do disagree a little bit with his concluding remarks, but let's see if we can find a way to be practical about this. Let me join both Alex and Shetil in offering those of you on the call my condolences. The last 2.5 years have been horrific for all of us who care about Tigray, but particularly for those of you who've lost friends and family. And I think for all of us who've watched what's happening, we know that transitional justice isn't a technical or a business as usual process. It should, if it's effective, be a set of really quite extreme measures to deal with an extreme situation. You bring in transitional justice processes when there's been terrible violence and the society in question needs urgently to transition out of this. When it works, it brings to bear a combination of social, political, and legal measures to confront what is awful, what's unthinkable, what's taboo. As Jean-Pierre Massiac has said, the more difficult the circumstances, the more important it is that transitional justice takes place. So it wasn't supposed to be easy, but it's adaptive, it's incremental, it's ad hoc, and it's suited to the context. So like Shetil and others on the call, I've also been looking at this horrible document, Policy Options for Transitional Justice in Ethiopia. And I think we still need to be bearing in mind that what's needed is an urgent package of measures to help a society understand the enormity of what it's just suffered and in some cases what it's still suffering. So I share the concern that's been expressed with the way reckoning with the past is being talked about in Ethiopia, as if it were past, as if this were some kind of formal or a technocratic process. It isn't, or it shouldn't be. It means dealing head on with current politics and current politicians. That's why, in my view, you should continue to engage with it, however imperfect it is. First rule of politics, be in the room. So there's that famous phrase that all of us who've done research in Ethiopia know so well, and it's still very clearly in play. People tell you, well, yes, it was really bad before, but now everything's okay. How many times have I heard that? If I had one birr for every time I've heard that when I was doing field work, I would be a rich woman by now. But this kind of failure to look at the current situation is still going on. The government's own policy options paper describes perfectly successive governments have either underrated or denied the very existence of conflict. They're still doing it. So there are lots of different things being juggled up together here. There's the need to confront a very longue durée history of extreme violence. Many of you will know this book of Richard Reid, The Frontiers of Violence in Northeast Africa, which is subtitled Genealogies of Conflict since 1800. And of course, one could go much further back in arguing that this has been a very violent part of the world forever. Now, it's true that Ethiopia would do really well to confront the horrifying levels of bloodshed inherent in its modern history, and in particular, the bloody patterns of conquest and slavery which marked its 18th and 19th centuries. This would mean taking a really long, hard look at the kind of nationalist and exceptionalist histories of the country, of which there's less sign currently than I think there has been for a long time. There's a rewriting of Ethiopian history along more traditional nationalist lines. So transitional justice in that context would mean embarking on a serious process of research and reconsideration of the very brutal foundations on which the modern state, its history of independent sovereignty, are prefaced. And it's precisely this kind of denialism which is all pervasive in Ethiopia. Absolutely no interest in looking at this kind of level of concern, whether about the past, whether about the recent past, whether about the immediate past. I think others have put it very clearly, and I completely agree. One good example is the Ministry of Justice's evidence given last month to the UN Human Rights Council's Committee Against Torture, which, amongst various other things they said that the Tigray authorities were responsible for what happened to Eritreans in refugee camps in Tigray. Extraordinary for a Ministry of Justice minister to say something like that. It's worth bearing in mind that there is a form of transitional justice that deals with this long histories. Canada, Australia, and Norway have all had transitional justice processes that have sought to atone, account, and apologise, make reparations for the egregious collective injuries done to First Peoples, Indigenous populations, First Nations. I would respectfully suggest that most educated Ethiopians are very far from being willing to confront the parallel histories of murder, expropriation, and enslavement on which Ethiopia is founded. And it's precisely this unwillingness which is at the heart of Ethiopia's current crisis. And if you like, that was one of the reasons why I was very happy to collaborate with Martin on this book, Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. Because for me, the causes of the war were a profound political division about the nature of the Ethiopian state. And until that's confronted head on, I don't see any approach to transitional justice going in the way that one would ideally want. But this kind of root and branch approach to transitional justice is a luxury, let's say, in post-conflict countries, and it isn't what most people have in mind when they're talking about transitional justice in Ethiopia now. They're talking about the sense of grievance they feel for what they've encountered in their lifetimes and their ongoing sense that someone should pay for that. So my biggest problem with this policy options for transitional justice coming from the government is that there are two different things going on. And this has allowed the government to conflate two completely different things and to evade confronting the politics of the situation. Yes, it's true. Ethiopia does absolutely need to have better institutions of justice, better courts, and a long-term judicial reform. But this process of holistic and ongoing reform isn't what the priorities for TJ should be about. In the documentation of the TJ options for Ethiopia, my fear is that it will become depoliticized, and this will be more and more the focus. So on the one hand, at some level, everybody knows at some level, even though they may continue to deny it, that something terrible has been carried out during the wars in Tigray and in Oromia since 2020 and 2019. That the extent of civilian violence and the numbers of deaths of combatants and civilians and the numbers of people whose lives have been permanently scarred by the wars are utterly unthinkable. We hear 4 or 5 times as many as died during the Derg period of the Red Terror, 4 or 5 times as many combatants injured as was the case during the whole of the Civil War period against the Derg throughout the 70s and 80s. Ethiopia won't get beyond this if it doesn't confront what's happened. And in principle, transitional justice mechanisms should be able to help with that. And I wouldn't give up on them because they're not going to be perfect. This isn't what's being proposed in this technical approach. Ethiopia isn't dealing with a perpetuation of an existing cycle. It's dealing with something that's gone on for 2,000 years, and what a shame. Yes, there's a history of violence in that area. What it needs to be dealing with today is with individual contemporary politicians who, through their actions, have unleashed a tidal wave of bloodshed in certain parts of the country. This didn't just happen. It was planned, financed, and directed. And a process of transitional justice which privileged the needs and voices of victims would need to address this. So this period of transitional justice isn't just about the national context needs it, or it can play an effective role in state building and sustainability, or it will help with democratization and lasting peace. It's an urgent priority to preclude the impunity, which means that we still haven't yet got to lasting peace. Of course, it's wonderful. It's a huge relief that the terrible rounds of active fighting in Tigray have stopped, in particular that barbaric 10-week period from the 24th of August to the 3rd of November last year, during which tens, if not hundreds of thousands of young people were slaughtered, and already starving civilians were deliberately kettled into TPLF-held areas without food. And I absolutely agree with Alex. It was a mistake in the 1990s not to prosecute the crime of forced starvation. But we don't have sustainable peace. As Alex and Shetel have stressed, it's not over. Those children who were abducted last week don't have sustainable peace. That 9-year-old who was raped in Raya months ago doesn't have sustainable peace. But most of all, we still don't have a collective public willingness to tell the truth about these facts. There's still Eritrean fighters on Ethiopian soil and militias in Western Tigray. There's still terrible bloodshed in Oromia, with fighting reported this weekend as close to Addis as Ambo. And this weekend also, 2 prominent and well-known politicians who, let's be honest, have a considerable constituency behind them, launched a new armed movement against the government, urging people to take up arms. So failure to address the politics of the current situation, without that, it's possible, Shetel might be right, whatever's proposed could make the situation worse, providing fig leaves for an elite settlement, which could reduce the prospect of justice. So before I finish with some messages from my side, let me just recap. What are those key pillars of transitional justice? They're the right to truth, the right to justice, the right to reparation, whether individual, collective, material, symbolic. As one woman said in a meeting I was in a couple of weeks ago, I just want the state to acknowledge what it did to us and to apologize for it. That's not reparation in the sense of prosecution, but acknowledgement, if nothing else. And of course, guarantees of non-repetition. So guarantees of non-repetition by itself, I think, should be a clarion call to everybody to engage with this process of transitional justice and to hammer on these 4 issues that this should really always be about. Let's let it get bureaucratized, if you like. Now, it's true that there are some problems with transitional justice, and Shetel's touched on one of them, this idea that truth and reparation may collide with non-repetition. And in particular, that reminds me of a really heartbreaking comment which was made by a practitioner in Mekelle recently, who said, I wonder, am I endangering the peace process by documenting what's happened to those who come to me for advice and professional services? And this absolutely broke my heart. And I think my message to all of you would be, no, this act of listening and of documentation and of preservation of this documentation is the most single important act you can be engaged with. So in concluding, what are my messages? First of all, you're in for the long haul. If you're going to do this, be prepared to spend decades working on it. As Alex said in his presentation just earlier on, there's still pain from the period of the Second World War over these kinds of atrocities. Secondly, documentation and evidence production is all. It may seem tedious, it may seem difficult, but it's so important. And thinking about the ongoing security of that data over the long term and in whatever circumstances is incredibly important. Third message, investigation shouldn't be the preserve of a single authority. National, international, and mixed processes are cumulative. They reinforce one another. They may overlap, but who cares? In this instance, if there's just a bit too much attention on this stuff, there's little reason why many processes shouldn't continue in tandem. And I find it absolutely extraordinary that the international community aren't committed to the maintenance of several different processes. By all means, support the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission if you think they're doing some good, but listen to the voices of victims who aren't satisfied by that commission, and also keep the existing international processes open. They can run alongside one another. There is no problem of duplication. Fourth message is that historical and judicial truth-telling are different, but they're both important. And here I think I most abruptly disagree with Shetil. One doesn't replace the other. You can have truth and reconciliation processes, you can have the historical truth-telling processes, and they can be incredibly effective and powerful. And probably they were underplayed during the 1990s. But in principle, truth and reconciliation processes don't preclude judicial processes. So there may be some specific issues about blanket amnesties. As I say, Shetil and I have argued about this for a long time through the 1990s, and will no doubt continue to disagree. Next message, be in the room. There has been some discussion I've heard about boycotting existing processes. And again, I think I would disagree, Shetil. If something's not perfect, doesn't mean to say it can't deliver some of what's needed. In my view, it's never a good idea to boycott existing processes unless circumstances really change in an extreme way. War resumes or some acute breakdown. I think it's essential for Tigrayans and other communities to continue to engage with whatever processes are on offer, however problematic and compromised they may seem, and to continue to call out those problems and compromises. If you're not there, you can't complain that you weren't represented. My corollary to the message, be in the room, would be please make sure you have women in the room. I'm very happy to have a woman chair, but I'm sorry to be the only woman speaker on this panel. Let's have more women speaking on these topics and being involved in the transitional justice process. Penultimate message, pursue all options. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Keep different options in play, continue to work ad hoc and opportunistically, as well as keeping sight of your principles. Yes, I agree, Shetil, you need some high-level decisions, and maybe that's particularly true of official commissions. But I think civil society bodies also need to be prepared to work with what's possible. And some options will only be opportunistic, not strategic, like the possibility of prosecuting individuals under universal jurisdiction, for instance. That only happens if you can find somebody who is vulnerable to those kinds of processes. Final message, though, is nobody's going to do this for you. Grassroots institutions will be absolutely critical to this process. And there are many of us who would be honored, I think, to be involved in a solidarity capacity, in helping, in supporting, in advising. Grassroots processes, institutions will need to coordinate, and they should work in tandem. Nobody wants to be re-traumatizing victims by making them give their testimony over and over again. But those initiatives should also be plural. It's not just the government, it's not just an official commission which should be allowed to work. Whatever happens to the UN Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, this is going to be a very long process. And there was one very clear message from a meeting I had recently with experts from an academic university human rights clinic who absolutely stressed the importance of Tigrayans remaining in the driving seat and continuing to be incredibly focused on what they see they need from these processes. So it's going to be a long haul. Don't give up. Don't reject any options would be my view. And I think we'll go on debating this for a long time. And you're not alone. There are many people around the world who would be very willing and very able to support you in this process. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Vaughn. I think one of the most powerful things that you just said is that you are not alone, because Tigrayans have felt very alone, even though there have been voices such as yours and many others who have spoken up. I found it interesting that you said you shared the conversation with the person who said, you know, am I endangering the peace process? We actually have heard that a lot in terms of, you know, we're talking about this as if everything has passed when there are still so many ongoing crimes that are occurring and people are still starving and people are still lacking medicine and so many women are not getting the care that they need after having been through horrific situations, and babies who have been born of this that we are asking lots of questions of and being denied access, which is very frustrating. And anytime or oftentimes when we hear Tigrayans speak up, we know that they're told, you know, anyone who gets in the way of peace will be held accountable. And we're thinking, you know, they're sharing a reality, their current reality, and it's a very frustrating situation. So thank you for sharing that and for calling out the fact that women are not in the room. This has been a very frustrating thing, and especially for Tigrayans and especially with our government, that this war has played out, this genocide has played out on the bodies of women and girls, and women are not involved to the extent that they should be in these conversations. It's been incredibly frustrating for so many of us. I want to ask you just one question, because I think I'm running a little bit off schedule, which is fine. You talked about the fact that Ethiopia can't move beyond this if we don't confront our history. And that has been one of the most profound things that many of us have come to realize, I think, in the past few years. Certainly, I'm speaking for myself in terms of we all bought into this story of this great country, which it's great in many ways, but the way that Ethiopia comes together is a very violent story, and we have to tell the truth about that. And there's been a lot of denialism from all of us, you know, coming up until this point. And so when we talk about denialism, often for us, for Tigrayans right now, we're talking about what happened over the past few years, but this denialism goes back so much further, and we're most certainly not there yet in terms of telling the truth of our story of how we come together. My question for you is, and I'm grateful that you tell a story about staying engaged and being a part of this process, even if it's not perfect, even if it feels incredibly unfair, just being in the room and being able to say that. What is the risk, or what are the potential consequences of failing to be a part of this process? How do we participate if we feel like we're not being heard, if we feel like we're not going to get the outcomes that we want? That's or even not that we want, that we need. It's very frustrating. So can you just talk about the consequences of turning our way or turning our backs on this process? That when the Pretoria Agreement was first released, we were crushed. I mean, that's not an exaggeration to say we didn't understand. Certainly the situation was that bad that anything was better than nothing. But many of us were saying, well, at least food will get in now, because food was weaponized. And so we said, well, at least people will eat now. I mean, those were the conversations that we were having, and that was a very frustrating conversation. So please, any thoughts you have on that?
It's interesting that you raised the issue of food insecurity, because I've been really struck the last 5 or 6 weeks. As you know, the food supply to Tigray has been cut again. I mean, this time last year, we were shouting and screaming and calling for an end to a blockade. We're in effectively the same situation now for other reasons, and nobody's saying anything about that. So I think, you know, the world isn't fair. There aren't the kind of institutions that maybe 30 years ago we thought we could rely on to do some of the work. I think a number of people 18 months ago said, oh, well, you know, when the food situation gets really bad in Tigray, the World Food Programme will step in, USAID will step in. Well, we know what happened. Those kinds of institutions, the kind of media that was able to be mobilized in the past are simply not there. And there's not the kind of interest in Tigray, unless it's created by Tigrayans. You know, it was Tigrayan activists in the diaspora that made all the difference. And it will continue to be Tigrayans working between the diaspora and with people on the ground, ideally as well coordinated as they possibly can be, which will continue to make this matter. So I think, yeah, it's always really uncomfortable discussion about how do you contribute, engage, be there without being co-opted. You know, does just being in the room mean that somehow you're lending your credibility to what's going on? I don't know. For me, politics is the art of the possible. And these transitional justice issues are profoundly about changing Ethiopia's politics. It's also about truth-telling and so on. But in the end, it's about having a better politics for everybody's kids and grandchildren. So, you know, I think that the stakes couldn't be higher. And in a sense, if we look away now, we're condemning the consequence of not engaging and not being involved in this is greater marginalization. Let's be clear. You know, nobody shouts. Nobody is going to push hard on this.
Incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Vaughn. I appreciate your time. Our next presenter is someone I've spoke to several times, one of my just favorite people because he's been on the front lines and he's not afraid to call a spade a spade. Dr. Professor Mukesh Kapila has extensive experience in global and public health, international development, humanitarian affairs, conflict and security issues, human rights and diplomacy and social entrepreneurship with substantive leadership roles in government, United Nations system and multilateral agencies, International Red Cross and Red Crescent, civil society and academia. He's an author and public and media speaker. His work has taken him to some 120 countries on all continents. Professor Kapila graduated in medicine from the University of Oxford and received postgraduate qualifications in public health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Since 2012, Dr. Kapila has been the professor, now emeritus, of global health and humanitarian affairs at the University of Manchester, UK, where he also founded and chaired the Manchester Global Foundation. Since 2020, he's also senior advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly for the Mediterranean, the principal forum for 29 national parliaments of the Euro-Mediterranean region, deliberating on the creation of best political, social, economic, and cultural environment for fellow citizens of member states. He also serves as advisor on several international bodies, including on the Strategic and Technical Advisory Group for Antimicrobial Resistance for the World Health Organization. Professor Kapila is the one who helped us understand the signature of this genocide in Tigray, and that being the violence that has played out on the bodies of women and girls. So I'm honored and so grateful to hear from you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me again. I wish we didn't have to have these meetings, but here we are a couple of years later, and we're still talking about it, and I'm afraid we will have to carry on doing that for some time to come. Now, many good things have already been said in this discussion, and I'm not going to repeat them, but to, in a sense, reference some of them and nuance some of the others and disagree with some other issues. My first point is that I don't understand transitional justice. I understand transitions, I understand justice, but I don't understand transitional justice. When you go to a court and get some justice done if as a victim yourself of some injury you may have sustained. Nobody talks about transitional justice. You know, either you get justice or you don't get justice. Either somebody is held accountable or not get accountable. You don't get transitional accountability. And of course, you don't have justice or accountability. So I suggest that this language of transitional justice is, in a sense, putting a smokescreen over quite a lot of considerations around the issue of justice. Pure, simple, when it's all said and done. Justice, no qualification for the crimes against humanity, including acts of genocide committed in Tigray. So that's my first point. A corollary of that point is that I don't believe in the African Union mechanism for transitional justice. When you get a bunch of people, half of them are lifelong dictators, and several of them have presided over egregious human rights abuses in their own states. And they're now making the laws around which these crimes are going to be judged. Well, come on. I mean, we may be stupid, but we're not naive. So there is no credibility in the African Union in relation to these processes at the present time. They haven't earned that credibility. Maybe the time will come when they will, maybe another 2-3 generations from now, but this ain't it. So to rely on them to set the framework for this is a pure, if I can call it gaslighting, really. Now, and if you look at their experience in this particular area, it's close to zero. Where have they actually brought a successful example of justice after egregious crimes against humanity? I can't think of that. I mean, my own experience, as you know, has been very much started in Rwanda, where I was during the genocide, and in Darfur when the genocide happened on my watch, when I was head of the United Nations there. And I found that the African Union, in both circumstances, were the block on any effort. Even Kagame realized that. And even he actually set up his own mechanisms in Rwanda. And I remember talking to him, and he was very much in favor of an international element to that, to what he was doing. And the reason for that was that one, he didn't have credibility. President Kagame at that time, General Kagame, didn't have credibility, if you like. He was just a general, but he understood that if his attempts to resurrect Rwanda has got to be credible, he had to bring in the wider international community. So, and because, as I remember a conversation very well in a football pitch in Kigali, because there was nowhere to sit, because everything was ruined in Kigali at that time. He said, a crime against humanity in one place is a crime against all humanity elsewhere, something I've quoted many, many times wherever. So the idea that we might rely on the Ethiopian government or the African Union for crimes committed in Africa, one is an insult to the victims, and secondly, it's an insult to Africans, because what we're effectively saying is that crimes of this nature committed against Africans are only serious enough to be addressed by Africans in African ways of thinking. They're not crimes that affect the whole of the world, therefore they're less important. So that's, in my opinion, not just rubbish, it is actually patently insulting. So that's my second point. And then, reflect, and here maybe I can share my experiences of being a connoisseur of genocides, having visited virtually every single situation where egregious crimes against humanity have been committed because of my 30-year-long career in many institutions, including the UN, Red Cross, and so many others, as you mentioned. Now, what happened so I think the good one was what Kagame did. You had a joint mechanism, a domestic element to which is close to the ground. And I remember attending the Kichacha courts myself and talking to the victims and the survivors in the prisons and so on at the time. and also then the court, the Arusha Tribunal, which was an international mechanism. And the good thing about that was that they were in parallel, but they were connected. They coordinated what went on. Unfortunately, what happened in Sudan was that while we managed to get the International Criminal Court engaged in this, however, I got a lot of abuse from professors and activists who said that I was prolonging the Sudan's war, the civil war, because I was bringing accountability and justice into it. The mantra at that time by many eminent people who are still active in the scene was, oh, well, let's have justice, let's have peace first, then we'll talk about justice. I mean, that was actually the kind of mindset at that particular time. So anyway, I'm glad we prevailed in getting the ICC engaged, and you know what happened. The president got indicted and ultimately removed by social pressure. But in parallel, the African Union messed up. What they did was it created a parallel mechanism, then getting 3 discredited African leaders, including Mbeki, and a couple of others who were lifelong dictators. And what they did was to confuse the whole process. So I remember going to South Africa and arguing with Mbeki's regime, his government, saying, why are they not arresting Bashir when he visited South Africa? You know, Bashir visited about, I think, at least 6 countries in Africa, members of the ICC, members of the African Union. And none of these countries arrested them. And this was led by Mbeki's government, who happened to be one of the eminent statesmen involved in the Darfur group. So they might have spent 40 days talking to Darfuris, but they sure as hell weren't listening. And in the end, what happened was that, again, a smokescreen of all this business. And I'm afraid you know what is happening. The ethnic violence in Darfur has resurfaced, and it has, I would say that it never went away because justice was never served, but it has resurfaced now, and it is going to be a critical element of the ongoing civil conflict that is going on in Sudan. And, I was talking about this to a Khartoum friend, in fact, an elite diplomat of the Sudanese government, who was very sorry about what his government did all those years ago. And then he said to me, he's now hiding in his house in Khartoum, and I just hope and pray he's safe. And what he said, we never cared what happened in Darfur. Because, the last time Khartoum had any great violence then was, I may be wrong, others can correct this, but last I heard, Khartoum had any problems was in the 1860s or 50s when General Gordon's head got chopped off when the British sent an expedition there. I mean, I may be kind of dramatizing here, but certainly the elites of Khartoum lived happily for decades while the periphery burnt. And I then witnessed it all over again in the Nuba Mountains when Ahmed Haroun, also indicted the ICC and was scot-free, recommitted ethnic crimes in the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile. And the African Union and the trioca of African leaders, it was happening while they were engaged in all this. What kind of credibility can you give to African leaders, especially superannuated ones now, in this particular framework? Come on, this is adding insult to injury, which is self-evident. That's, I think, my strong message to Tigrayans. Don't think that the African Union is going to come to your rescue. Well, if anything, even kind of elementary student of politics would say that the difference with Rwanda was that the genocidaires were expelled, right? The difference with Cambodia, which had its own international mechanism, which has done a lot in Cambodia, was that the genocidaires were expelled. And therefore, you could have the luxury of crafting quite creative justice solutions there in terms of accountability, justice, and whatever else had followed. The same, by the way, in the former Yugoslavia around Srebrenica, where I was very actively involved as well. Unfortunately, the genocidaires are still in power in Ethiopia. They're not going anywhere. and they are being supported by their colleagues in the premier institution for the continent. So it's extremely important to call a spade, if as taking your example that you quoted me on. So that's one thing. Now, so however, where does this leave us when it comes to talking about justice? Oh, by the way, before I get to that, one other point. You know, one thing I've learned, and this is from my medical careers, which includes psychology, and it also includes my career talking to the survivors of genocide in 5 continents. Never distinguish between the seriousness of different types of crimes. So it's absolutely right. Sexual violence is the signature tune of the Tigrayan crimes against humanity, as is famine. But in my opinion, whether you starve to death or whether you're raped before you starve to death is a moot point. So I think it's extremely important that we do not have any strange mechanisms that somehow value different types of inhumanities, because I don't know how to value these different types of humanities. I would know if they affected me, but I'm the last one to say that famines deserve a special whatnot track, and rape deserves another track. They're all, like human rights are indivisible, so are human rights crimes and inhumanities. It's extremely important that and when everybody in Tigray suffered in their own way, if you see what I mean. But all that suffering is equal. It's extremely important to kind of make that point, if I may. Now, coming to the core of this session, which is really where do we go from this? Well, my first thing is don't give up. And I'm just, I was writing an article recently about something else. And I was thinking a lot about Armenia and the denialism around the Armenian genocide, and which was committed under the Ottomans, but the modern day Turkey and that general region continues to be sensitive about this issue. But meanwhile, the French Parliament has declared Armenian genocide to take place. I think so has the American Congress, and few others are done. Who cares whether it's recognized as a genocide by some apex court somewhere else? In the court of public opinion and in the court of history, which will outlast the International Criminal Court, the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights, or the Ethiopian system, or anybody else's system, and you and me, it will establish that a grave harm was done to the people of Armenia. And scholars for the last 100 years have been studying it, and they will continue to study it for the year. So my message to the people of Tigray is, it is the court of public opinion and the court of history that is the most important for you. And it is there where you must never give up. It is there where you must make sure that what happened in Tigray is not forgotten, and not be discouraged when the bureaucratic institutions of formal justice provide blocks along the way. So that's would be my key point. Having said that, I think obviously one should cooperate with credible judicial mechanisms wherever they are in a good-hearted manner. But I disagree with I think Sarah when she said that people should always engage with them and not boycott them. No, I disagree with that. The reason for that is that, and I know this from my personal experience, if you like, you see, that engagement is always a form of recognition. Always, always, always. And we see that, for example, in what is going on, for example, in Belarus at the moment, or in some of the incarcerations that are taking place in China or elsewhere, where you might say, or around Hong Kong or Tibet or whatever. And we are human beings. What that means is, and I know also from Sudan, that many of my rebel friends in Sudan, in the peripheries of Sudan that were my allies at that time, they, as I was trying to draw attention to what's going on, they have sadly over time been co-opted into the ongoing system of oppression, which has brought Sudan to the situation where we are now, that you know all about. I don't have to go over. Who you consort with has a strong bearing on where you end up and on whose side you end up. We always must remember that, and not engaging with the forces, not engaging with institutions which are not fair, just, biased, etc., is a form of signaling that's more powerful than having a seat in the back row of a courtroom or an observer status in some of the mechanisms in Geneva that I am constantly going to, because that's where I generally live. So I think a more principled stand is for Tigrays never to accept incomplete justice or compromised justice, because once they do that, the battle is lost. In other words, no to transitional justice, yes to justice. No to justice on any terms other than the principles of universal justice as espoused by international mechanisms which cover the whole world, which cover every country in the world, whether individual countries like it or not do it. You cannot have mechanisms which are kind of appropriate for some places are a compromise. And I do not at all agree that justice, transitional justice as a way of bringing about better politics is acceptable. If that was the case, then of course, you see, everything is possible. You can compromise away, compromise away. You can find some few people that you can kind of lock up and say, these are the criminals. You can, some people can be got to say sorry, and you can then kind of, kiss and make up, and then say, oh, well, now it's gone, it's happened. No, not at all. It is extremely important. Tigrayans will lose. They lost many things, but they will lose in the court of history, and they will lose in the court of global public opinion, which is what really matters. If they compromise on issues of principle, either because they're fed up or because they're forced to, because they're starving, and this is the price to pay for getting your food in, which is a very shabby compromise that will be required. And it's not for me to say to a hungry person that you must not compromise if it means them being able to live. I have no right to say that. But but thank God I'm not there, and thank God therefore, even though I'm a humanitarian and health person by kind of by profession, these things have to be looked at from a little distance, which allows, therefore, a little separation between the heartbreaking kind of thing you see in front of you. Important to say, and I know this as a doctor confronting the patient in front of me, and then I say, no, the wider public health policy is that which brings a greater good to the greater number of people. I'm sorry for your suffering, but I will not compromise on the bigger issue, which affects all of us and all of you. This matter, because genocide or genocidal atrocities in one place are a crime against humanity everywhere, now goes beyond what the people of Tigray want. So while the people of Tigray are central to the solution, and in the end, they are the most valid people to decide what form of justice and accountability will suit them. They are not, they're no longer the sole judges of that. because what they decide has a bearing on the next bunch of atrocities being committed in some other part of the world. And there are plenty of those taking place now, including back in my previous haunt of Sudan. So let me conclude there by saying, be resolved, be ready for the long run, do not compromise on principle, and justice cannot be compromised on expedient politics or on short-term gains, even though that means extending the suffering and resistance. What I'm predicting is that we will have renewed war in Ethiopia. Oh, one final postscript, which is important. And this really comes out also from my Rwanda experience, where the focus has been understandably on the Tutsi, and the official title is correctly, it's a genocide against the Tutsi. But tens of thousands of Hutus perished also. It wasn't a genocide against the Hutu, that's why we don't use that term there. But I think anyone who wants to see justice and accountability in Rwanda acknowledges the harms and wrongs done to other groups in Rwanda, even though the genocide was only against the Tutsi. You get my point. Similarly, in any consideration of justice in Tigray, in Ethiopia, one has to include in that justice the wrongs done to all the other communities in Ethiopia, which may or may not amount to genocide. I'm not saying that. And this is not about equating what happened in Tigray to what happened in other parts, but simply to say that if you're going to go on the path of justice, then it has to be justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. You gave us a lot to think about. You said Tigrayans should never accept incomplete justice or compromised justice. And I think, we very much relate to that and very much, at least in the diaspora. And as you pointed out, it's easy for us in the diaspora who aren't starving to death, who aren't dying because of lack of medicine, to be more firm in some of these things. But the reality is even Tigrayans on the ground are very frustrated because they're not a part of this process. They still see Eritreans in Tigray. The entire Western Tigray is still occupied. So they're still just very frustrated by the lack of justice, but they're being told there's now peace, right? There's now peace, and it's frustrating. You gave us an example of in Cambodia where the genocidaires were expelled, but that's not going to happen in Ethiopia. We know it's not going to happen because the African Union supports the Abiy regime. We know that, frankly, the Americans support the Abiy regime. There was the State Department had a determination of genocide and never released it, because they apparently got what they wanted from this regime in terms of negotiations. So what do we do? How do we move forward? What should we focus on in terms of justice if we know, I think it's safe to say we won't get complete justice. We will not get what we consider, it will be compromised justice at this point. I don't know if that changes down the road, but right now, when the perpetrators are still in charge and responsible for investigations, we won't get justice. No one is going to say, yes, I give my hands, I was responsible for this. It's just not going to happen. So what do we focus on if we can't get the type of justice that Tigrayans deserve?
Well, I think if we agree, not necessarily everyone will agree, but for the point of this discussion, if we agree that compromised justice or incomplete justice, shall we distinguish the two? Compromised justice certainly will make the situation worse because it will not take away the hurt of people wherein lie the seeds of future conflict, right? And the purpose of justice is actually not even to have accountability. It is to heal. The ultimate purpose of justice is to heal. We can argue about accountabilities and degrees of compensation along the way, but there is no point to justice unless it heals, because only with healing can we move forward. So, so to me, this really requires very little discussion, because if you want to heal Ethiopia and get over the thousands of years of trauma, hundreds of years of trauma, however long you want to go back, then you got to kind of do things differently. And politicize justice, combat justice ain't the answer. It's not going to bring you peace, it's not going to bring you satisfaction, and it's only going to actually hurt the people more. So what do we focus on? Well, we focus on, I think some of the things have already been mentioned by colleagues. The first one is a document, and document. And I'm really struck by the Holocaust Memorial projects and how, for example, they started too late because technology didn't exist at that time 30, 40 years ago. But now they're busy recording the voices and memories of the last remaining survivors. Some of them are really almost 100 years old, if not there. And it's very extraordinary. We have the technology to make it available. In Rwanda, the Kigali Genocide Memorial is busy collecting naming every person. In Kigali Genocide Memorial, there is a wall. What they're trying to do is to name every single person who died. And every time I visit there, I see another forest of names go up. You know, no one who died in Rwanda, maybe 1 million people died. Maybe slowly, everyone will be named. No one will remain unnamed. It might be a crime that was once nameless, but victims must never be nameless. So what that means is that we should, and the friends of Tigray, on which I am an eternal friend, we should document, we should record, and every single individual who suffered, their testimony and their name should be recorded, right? And this done. The other thing we should do is we should memorialize. What I mean by that is, and I've seen that also in places I've visited, is that there are these, you travel around Rwanda, or you go to the different Holocaust museums around the world. What you see is the experience living, you know, and when the experience is living in physical mementos, in artifacts, in memorials, in churches and temples, and any other way you can memorialize. And today, of course, we have the wonderful thing of digitization, where we can actually digitalize anything we want. Then the thing never dies. And as long as the thing never dies, then the quest for justice never dies. So I would do that. And nowadays, of course, we have the skilled, and I was very much involved in Bosnia and around the Srebrenica. And I'm just constantly amazed at what is going on, even to this very moment, how the forensic scientists, the pathologists, and the other scientists, half of which I don't even understand what the science is, but they're busily reconstructing minutest of details about what happened in Srebrenica, so that, you know, not a single piece of violated DNA or a single blood stain is going unrecorded, because it is all part of the testimony, it is all part of the eternal memory, and therefore it is an invaluable contribution to the quest for justice, which is also eternal, which is also permanent. And I think we should do that. I was trying to do that in relation to Darfur, but of course, as my friends pointed out, you know, in Darfur, it wasn't an industrialized society. Therefore, you know, all the houses got burnt and the villages got burnt and so on and so forth. And there isn't any much of mementos left, other than shards of clothing and so on, which I'm getting people to collect and place, so that the successors can look at. So memorialization is important, separate from evidence gathering and recording and all of that, but it's an important point of it. Finally, I think it is extremely important to have solidarity of the survivors. So, you know, this is why it is extremely important that the people of Tigray share their suffering and empathize with the suffering of others, the Rohingya, the Uyghur, the others around the world. Because if what I find difficult about the Darfuris in the early phases 20 years ago was they were so consumed by their own misery, they could not think about the misery of the Nuba Mountains or the Blue Nile. And it took a bit of kind of effort to try and say, hey, you're all in the same peripheral boat, if you like, which, and such like. Come together. And I'd like to, the various kind of movements that started across, ultimately it resulted in South Sudan's independence, essentially for reasons, the racist project that al-Bashir had. Now, so what I'm saying is that the people of Tigray should empathize, work with, join hands with the people of Rohingya, the people of survivors of the Yazidi in Iraq, and many other such people, and make common cause. There are far more hurt survivors out there than we realize. Individually, a bunch of survivors are just kind of, maudling about their own suffering. But when they share their suffering with others and share their suffering, then one, the suffering is a consolation, and secondly, they're more powerful than they realize.
Thank you so much, Professor Kapila. I have like 10 more questions, but we don't have time. So that's the nature of our conversations whenever we speak. So thank you for everything that you do and your just role in this world of being someone who's not afraid to call out genocide and, inhumanity, and always standing with the people who are impacted. So we're so very grateful for all that you do. I was particularly struck that you said it's been 30 years since the Rwandan genocide and names are still being added. So it makes me think of how long this journey is gonna be for the people of Tigray, and document. So thank you so much for being with us today. Wow, a powerful conversation. We have one more speaker who was with us today, and this is going to be a very interesting conversation because our next speaker is the Associate Professor Yamane Zerai, and what's great about his contribution here is he is also a survivor of the Tigray genocide. And so we're really excited to hear Associate Professor of Political Science at Mekelle University, and also a commissioner of the Commission of Inquiry on the Tigray Genocide, which was established last year. Yamane, with his colleagues, are not only investigators, but are survivors and direct witnesses of what happened in Tigray. So Yamane Hawe, welcome. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening all. Thank you, Chairwoman Milita and the organizers. I'm so happy to join you, at the same time thrilled to talk after such accomplished scholars and big personalities. My talk will be mainly on three major issues. I'll try to reflect to have some reflections on the transitional justice, which is actually in place and being mentioned in Ethiopia. Then the importance of investigation, thorough investigation and documentation of the atrocities in this area. And the third one would be what we are doing in this regard, if documenting and investigating is very important in this area. What we are doing in our commission will be my last one. To be frank, it will be very hard to talk about these issues as being a survivor, a witness, and at the same time, as a one who is coordinating and leading the research and inquiry. So because of that, I may have some mix of agendas and I may lack clarity. My apologies for that, but I hope Melita will help me in clarifying some issues in the follow-up questions. On the transitional justice in general, we may comment on can it work, at what level can it work, at what form can be workable, with what process and with which actors will be workable are very important questions that my preceding speakers were commenting well. I will raise some four major issues on which are serious concerns of the transitional justice which is being promoted these days in Ethiopia in different forms. At one hand, we have the so-called the draft position paper on the policy options for transitional justice. On the other hand, we have also side talks on transitional justice and I'll raise for major issues. The first one is the place of the Pretoria Agreement on these talks. I have never seen a Pretoria Agreement on the draft policy work. Group of people from the federal government were here in Mekelle before a month, led by the Justice Minister, the Justice Minister, and also Dr. Gideon Timotheus, and the Human Rights Commissioner, Dr. Daniel Bakala. They never have mentioned this one. They just has talked the transitional justice as it is for Ethiopia. We all understand that the Pretoria Agreement is an agreement which is meant to be negotiated, but it is a political document to be changed through negotiations into a legal one. And we all know that this agreement is not governed by one actor, Tigray and TPLF were signatories, and there were third parties, but the issue of third party in the justice area is not mentioned. This is one thing. The second one is on the Ethiopian policy option draft. There is no mention of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy Framework, even though there are shortcomings that are raised even in the AU framework. Even with all its weakness, it may have a place to serve here in our case, but no mention of this framework. The document produced by the Ethiopian government has no mention of the African Union transitional policy framework. So in relation to the Pretoria Agreement or the purpose it is to serve, it is an issue. The third one is the coverage in terms of time, in terms of geography. In terms of time, it tries to cover all the times we had tens of decades in one area, and in the second option, so 3-4 decades. In terms of geography, in terms of issue, it tries to cover all Ethiopia and also all issues all over the country. Atrocities in every, no mention of the Tigray war. No mention of the atrocities as a result of the genocide in Tigray. So we cannot say that the draft position document is about Tigray or is to serve Tigray. The fourth one is on the actor involvement, on the role of regional organizations, continental organizations, or global organizations. It mentioned nothing on this. It tries to make it national, and we consider it as indigenization of the issue, indigenization of even the Pretoria Agreement, which was signed in the eyes of the international actors. It totally ignores the international aspect of the atrocities. We believe that the atrocities committed are international atrocities. First, by the time of crimes committed, the crimes, the war crime against humanity, genocide, and even a crime of aggression has happened in Tigray. So by the type of the crimes, they are international. Secondly, by the involvement of international actors, it has international dimension. Without mentioning the Eritrea, the involvement and the atrocities committed by the Eritrean forces, you cannot say that you are to bring justice. What are they to talk with the people in Aksum without mentioning the atrocities mentioned happened there by the Eritrean forces? What are they to say to the Negash people the people in Negashi, who has witnessed the destruction of the Negashi mosque there and all other things. So with this, we can say that the issues that we are talking about even is not clear. I share Professor Mukesh Kapila's concerns that are we to talk about workable transitional justice to Tigray, or are we talking about the agenda which is raised by the Ethiopian government, which is totally unrelated with the problems that we have, that is be an issue. The second thing that I want to raise is the role of investigation and sort of investigation and damage assessment on bringing justice and workable peace. Issues of transitional justice in one or another way are related with determining on the nature and kind of crimes, the extent and depth of the understanding, the extent and depth of the damage, on identification of perpetrators, identification of survivors, victims, then proper intervention as rehabilitation, proper reparation schemes, reconciliation even is related with knowing what really has happened, knowing the truth. Guarantee for recurrence is a very important thing in bringing justice and bringing sustainable peace. And how can you guarantee without recognizing what really has happened? And having proper policy and institutional reform cannot come without knowing this. So in this, three major issues are to be raised. What is to be assessed and investigated? Is it, as I have said, the historical one, or the thing that really has happened in the last 2-3 years? Who is to investigate? The national or international actors? As it is said, the perpetrators themselves are the perpetrators themselves to investigate our issue and bring us justice? What would be the role of impartial international bodies in this area? What is the role of survivors, victims? Are they observers? Are they mere participants, or are they central players in this regard, in this justice? This should be answered. And the third one is, where is the assessment and investigation to be done? Is it to be done remotely or on the spot? We are arguing, and still the people is expecting that international investigation will be done, but not remotely, but here in Tigray. We have to sense not only what we are saying in media and in papers, what we are living in, not only in the human suffering reflected by the human body, but by the environment. What are our forces even telling you? What are our animals telling you with this regard? What our roads, our schools are to talk, to convey message in this regard should be observed here. And so these issues should be addressed properly. But still, even though these are issues, we don't sit idly, even during the dark periods where bombs were being having us in cities and everywhere. The people and the government in Tigray have decided to investigate, to study the damage, and also documentation was being raised almost by all of them. Documentation, memorialization are very important that you have raised. So what are we being done? What are we doing, and what are we doing these days is very important in this regard. And the commission that I am leading in this case is a central one. Our commission, the Commission of Inquiry on Tigray Genocide, was established before a year, around May last year, 2022. And we focus our inquiry on 6 major aspects. The first one is on the damage on humanity, on human being. The second one is on the weaponized. We don't normally say the gender-based violence. The weaponized sexual gender-based violence, the weaponized one. This was the second. The third one is the damage on the economy sector. The fourth one, the damage on the physical infrastructure. The fifth one, the damage on the environment and the ecosystem, the natural resources. And the fifth one, the sixth one is the damage on institutions and values and also heritage. All institutions, especially the governmental institutions, which are highly related with the public life, the public institutions, the values that we have in terms of religion, in terms of the heritage, and even the festivities. Some of you may have been here in Tigray in time of Ashanda in August. You can understand how people get excited there, and you can understand the economic movement at the time. What really has happened to such festivities, such values, the historical values that we had, the heritage. So we're trying to make assessments and investigations on these thematic areas. And we're trying to understand what really has happened using three major methods. The first one is investigation, a deep, thorough investigation. And we made investigations in four thematic areas: on humanity, on the weaponized gender-based violence, on the environment, and also on the heritage and religious institutions. This was the investigation, and we have the second methodology, that is the census-based damage. Professor Kapila was mentioning that all Tigrayans suffered in their own way. Yes, we all suffered. Not only all as human beings, all dimensions of our life are suffered. We suffered in all dimensions, and all should be documented. Everyone, everything. So we decided to go on census-based damage assessment in for the three areas. The first one is for the general public, house to house, household-based census. The second one is on the private sector and on the civil society and NGOs. The third one is the government. The government in Tigray is not only administrative, it is also a service, a huge service provider in terms of education, health, agriculture, and others. So the government institutions are also our target of assessment. Studying the government means understanding the one dimension of the damage. So we try to go house to house, what really has happened to everyone, as Professor Marcus Kapila had, to everywhere. What really has happened to the private sectors, the civil society associations, and cultural communities that we have, what really has happened to the hundreds of thousands of institutions, and to the government. All we had regional government institutions and federal government institutions like universities, airports, and others, which were owned by the federal government, but which are in Tigray. So we have tried to assess this. And the third method is the secondary sources, which are very important, the historical as well as contemporary ones, like reports, historical writings, media reportings, and others should be documented, because documentation is very important. Now, so far, we have done more than 20,000 investigations in the four areas that I have mentioned you. On the census-based damage assessment, sorry, I haven't mentioned here the thematic areas. Also on the census-based damage in the household, private sector, and government, especially in the household, we have four areas. One group is on the economy, social, and humanity. One data collector, one data enumerator will go to the house, having these three questionnaires. Questionnaires on economic damage in the household, questionnaire on the social values and social aspect of the damage, and the third one is on the humanity damage, like death, disappearance, disability, psychological problems, and others. And a second group of enumerators were also going to the household. That is the enumerators for the weaponized gender-based violence, because we believe that the victims in this case dominantly are women, females. So the data collectors must be women so that they can properly communicate. And there are cultural things that are particular in our case. So 2 data enumerators were entering into a household with a very huge questionnaire, a very huge questionnaire. I don't know, we may have been idealistic, but we had more than 160-page questionnaire to be asked to each household. And it was very difficult at the time, very difficult for the data enumerator to work on, because we were being distinguished during war, in a war economy here. We had no phone, had no internet, had no money, had no transportation, and way of even communicating and supervising. But the most important is on the side of the respondents which are so traumatized, who were so starving at the time. It was hard to convince them to just to answer even. For some of them, it was just a means of healing the trauma that they have. For some of them, it was just repeating what can I say? Just remembering again and again what they have suffered. So it was very difficult, but we have achieved to go to around 1 million households. But because getting the collected data from each data collector to our commission was very hard. The number of questionnaires in the 4 areas are which are cleared and in our hand are different. For the economy, we have a clear, cleaned and organized document at hand of about 660,000 for the economic sector. For the social sector, the same 6,500,000 questionnaires are cleared and now labeled. For the humanity, 620,000 questionnaires are at hand. For the sexual and gender-based violence, we have 480,000 questionnaires at hand. These are separate from the investigation. So our outreach was so fast, but compared to the targets that we had, it is a very few. We believe that we only have reached about 45 to 50% of the targets. So we have a lot to go in the coming 3 to 4 months again, both in the data collection and other things. In the private sector, we were targeting about 160,000 institutions, private and social institutions. But we were able only to assess 46,000 institutions. These are institutions, whether hotels, agricultural investments, trades, private colleges, schools, and so on. In terms of number, it is huge because it is we are talking about institutions, not individuals. It is a very huge one, but in terms of what we have targeted, still we have achieved only 1/3 of our target. On the government, we have we have tried to assess 81 government institutions. When I say 81, it is a collectivity. When for instance, the Education Bureau will represent the education sector owned by the government. Otherwise, we have more than 2,600 schools in Tigray. We have more than 2,500 health posts, clinics, government-owned hospitals in Tigray. But we consider them as one collectively, and we have tried to assess 81 big institutions, government institutions, like bureaus, agencies, commissions, universities, and others. But we achieved only 60% of our target, both vertically, horizontally, and in terms of having clear information, even from the government. It was very hard also to get information from the government because the government as a whole was in war at the time. So we have tried to, at least we believe that we have achieved at least to get to collect information. Then in the last 2 months, we have began to extract the data that we have collected through the so-called open data kit system through phones, because collecting data through paper was difficult at the time. So we have to use at least the phones that were existing in Tigray in the old good times. But getting electric charger for the phone was very difficult, by the way, even because almost much of Tigray was without electricity, and the data collectors should come to urban areas to get electricity through generators and others. So, but at least we have huge data, which can be documented. The data now is being analyzed. The data now is being changed into some very big cases to be submitted. I can say to the UN Commission if it continues. And anyways, we have to submit to international bodies. We have to send data to the international world so that the international world can know our case. We have to send data to the diaspora, Tagaro, so that they can use as a tool to advocate our case. So we have able to collect data. We have able to have two-step analysis, that is extraction of the data, cleaning the data. Now we are organizing and labeling the data. In the next 3 weeks, we'll be able to have an aggregate number in terms of quantity or what we have lost, at least economically, at least in terms of number. We will have a first report at the end of June in terms of what really has happened through the investigation, especially on the weaponized gender-based violence. And we have reorganized our service in the last 2 months to also work on a second round of data gathering, data collection for Western Tigray, not covered as a whole. So we have tried to have some data from the IDPs, from 40 IDP centers, but we don't believe that it all represents what really has happened in Western Tigray. We have data, uncollected data, even in Mekelle. We didn't cover all. We have data, uncollected data, which has happened after August 2022, the second round. 36 Waradas were directly occupied by Eritrean and other forces. More than 10 cities, towns, cities, including Mekelle, were bombarded by air, drones, and also artillery. We have to investigate these things. So we have a lot also to collect. As I have said, we have private sectors that we have to cover. When we say we have to collect data to cover, it is not about only physical damage that they have. It mainly is about Professor Alex Doan was mentioning about the starvation, especially. Much of the damage has happened because of the 360 degrees encirclement and the total siege that we all have suffered. University professors were lining in a queue to get 2 liters of edible oil. From the military general to a simple daily worker, all has suffered, from the top official, scholar to every corner of our life is affected by that. So our questionnaires, our data instruments mainly also not only focuses on the direct damage, but also on the starvation of the people, on the losses, direct and indirect losses the initiatives have occurred. So by that, that's why we have a very big data collection, questionnaire and data collection instruments that we have had. And I am sure the next 2 to 3 months are very important to us, because we have to work hard and go forward in collecting what really has happened.
ሎማ ዓመት ግን በምትዕብባር ርእሰ ኣድባራት ወገዳማት ኣክሱም ጽዮን ቤተ ክርስቲያን ቤት ትምህርቲ ሰንበት ዩኒቨርሲቲ ኣክሱም ምምሕዳር ከተማ ኣክሱምን ቢሮ ባህሊ
would be interested. And as Melita, you have rightly said, we will use, if not in the next month, if not in the next year, even in the coming 10 years. But our goal is to use it as much as possible.
نربع عامتين كلتو ورحن يسرح.
سلاسان حموشتن عام سريح ممرنت.
ممهر برها قبر هيوت.
physically in suffering, but they are suffering psychologically.
تملكتنا حزن نركب اللبوتا أبزوا مبراق وردا قلوم خدايو أبي أرقباي مدباينا نركب كاب قدام دبر دامو من قدي نعم.
That is what I can say, and I can add on some questions. Thank you very much.
Wow. Professor Yamane, that is really impressive. I think you've shocked a lot of us who didn't know the depth of what was happening with this commission of inquiry of the Tigray genocide. And this started even before, way before the Pretoria Agreement was even signed. So in the midst of you know, the fire, basically, is when you guys started. It's really impressive. We're over on time, so I'm gonna, 2 quick questions. I have so many questions, but my promise and my hope is that I can follow up with you and we can do a completely different show about all the work that you've been doing, because it's just incredible. And I think it's something we can all help you with and partner with you on to make sure that the data is, you know, effective and used the way that it should be, and whatever support that you need from us. So that being said, I was touched when you said the conversations that are happening with the Minister of Justice and Dr. Gideon and Daniel Bakala with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission don't mention Pretoria. They don't mention the AU Transitional Policy Framework. A lot of the coverage areas don't make sense. They're not Tigray specific. And so my question around that is, how do the people of Tigray feel? How do you all feel when, as you're watching so-called justice or transitional justice taking place on the terms that the Ethiopian government and apparently the African Union are putting forward? I'm curious about how you all feel about that just in general. And then my second question is related to the work that you've been doing. It's Herculean, the data collection that you guys have done in such a short amount of time. Clearly, you're the leader on gathering this data and information that is going to be helpful for telling the story of what has happened and the number of households that you've been able to touch and the research that you've been able to do. So I'm curious, how big is your team? It must be a big team because you've done a lot of work. And then I also want to know how, you've touched on this a little bit, but how is the data being used or not? I guess it's the report is coming out in June. So what are your hopes for how the data will be used? And also, how can we support you? And do you have the support of the Tigrayan government in this work? I mean, I think you were appointed by the Tigrayan government, but how has that been playing out in terms of collecting all of this information? So just maybe within 5 minutes, because I know we're well over our time today.
Okay, thank you very much. On the issue of how we feel on the so-called transitional justice, we don't know how the world feel, but the ordinary people, when they hear the so-called transitional justice, they don't consider it as justice. They consider it as anti-justice. They consider it as something which comes to cover up what really has happened. That's why it is because, for one thing, we follow that there is no clarity, not only on the document, on the whole process. The Ethiopian the so-called Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission talks about it. Previously, we had so-called Reconciliation Commission, Boundary Commission. Now the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has tried to come to Tigray and talk about it. It was always a lot of fire from participants, from all corners of life. The so-called task force established by the Minister of Justice has drafted a document, and with all these things, we feel that the Ethiopian government is trying to bombard us with concepts to deceive the international community that it is working. And to make us rather defiant of the process. So we say just it is to serve as a cover up of like I say, escaping accountabilities and bringing impunity to the case. This is one. On how big my team is, actually, until last month, we all were volunteers. I am a commissioner appointed, and my deputy is also appointed. All the others were volunteer professionals. But we were able to mobilize together with the universities in Tigray, mobilize more than 30,000 data collectors and supervisors.
ተመልከትና ሕዝን ንርከበሉ ቦታ ኣብ ዞባ ምብራቕ ወረዳ ግሎም ኸዳ እዩ ኣብ ጣብያ ርግባይ መደባ ኢና ንርከብ ካብ ገዳም ደብረ ዳሞ መንገዲ ንኣንፈት የማን ተገንፂልና ፍሉይ ሽሙ ናብ ሓሙሽተ መደባ ኢና ክንጓዓዝ ኣብዚ ከባቢ እዚ ሓደ ውራይ ኣለና ነበርትን ተወለድትን ሓሙሽተ መደባይ ሓደ ዓብዪ ሰናይ ተበግሶ ወሲዶም ምንቅስቃስ ጀሚሮም ኣለው እንታይ እዩ ምንቅስቃስ እንታይ እዩ ሰናይ ተበግሶ ዝብል ሓቢርና ክንሪኦ ኢና
engineers. So we had to mobilize voluntarily. All these were voluntary, unpaid, because there was no one paying.
ኣብዚ ተፈላለዩ ከባብታት ዝነብሩ ተወለድቲ መደባይን ከባቢኡን ግምቱ ልዕሊ 500,000 ብር ዝግመት ናውቲ ትምህርቲ ንዝዓበየሉን ዝተምሃሩሉን ቤት ትምህርቲ መደባይ ሓገዝ ኣበርኪቶም እቲ ሓገዝ ብቐሊሉ ዘይረኣይ ልዑል ረብሓ ዘለዎ እዩ ዝበሉ ኣባል ካቢኔ ጊዜያዊ ምምሕዳር ትግራይን ሓላፊ ቢሮ ትምህርቲ ትግራይን ዶክተር ኪሮስ ጉዑሽ እታ ቤት ትምህርቲ ባዕላውን
should be done professionally.
تشن 14 ترتاواتي مالتي 4 عامات كبار سريح
ن4 عامتين كلتو ورحن يسريح
35 عامات سريح ممرنت
ممهر بره جبر هيوت ممهر اسماء موهايلون ممهر صهيا سفاون كاب 35 كساب 4 عامات بمويا ممرنت اب كتما خصومن زتفلالو كبابتاتن زغلغلو ممهران انطقون كاب كلتشعن 14 اقوطاط راغز ግን ናይ ጥሮታ ዕድሚኦም መሊኡ ዝተሰናበቱ ዋላ ኳን ተኾኑ እቲ ንዓመታት ዝሰርሕሉ ጥሮታ ግን ክወሃበም ብዘይ ምኽኣሉ ኣብ ዓብይ ፀገም ከም ዝወደቁ ንትግራይ ሚድያ ሃውስ ተዛሪቦም
ሽማይ መምህር በርሀ ገብረ ህይወት ይባል ስርሐይ መምህር እዩ ኣብ 2014 ጥሮታ ወፅየ ማለት እዩ ኣብቲ ክባን ዕፅዋን ዝነበረ ክባን ዕፅዋን ከያኽለና ኣብዚ ሕጂ ዝነይናሉ ሰዓት ድማ መንግስቲ ንኣብነት ኣነ እንተ ኮይነ ታህሳስ 2014 ጥሮታ ወፅየ ማለት እዩ 4 ዓመት ከባቢ ሰሪሐ ስለዚ ጥሮታይ ሰሪሖም ክፍሊ ትምህርቲ ማለት እዩ እቲ ዝነበረኒ ስራሕይ ሰሪሖም ዶክመንተይ ናብ ማሕበራዊ ዋስትና ሓሊፎም እዮም ወሓበራዊ ዋስትና ድማ ሰርሑልና እንተልናዮም ከመይ ጌርና ንሰርሓልኩም ናይ ሕሉፍ ናይ 2014 ስለዚ ተኸፈለና ንዓና ዝኽፈል ገንዘብ ስለዚ ተኸፈለና ንሰርሓልኩም ኣይንኽእልን ኢሎምና ሕጂ ተዓቢ ፀገምና ንሕና ስድራ ሒዝና ኢና ቆልዑ ሒዝና ኢና ከምኡውን ኣብ ገዛ ኸራይ ዝነብር ሰብ ኣሎ ስለዚ እቲ ዝነበረ ዕፅዋን ክባን ከይኣክል ሞይሹ እውን ሕጂ ደመወዝና እውን ስርሑልና ኣይንሰርሕን ጥሮታ ማሕበራዊ ዋስትና እውን ስርሑልና ኣይንሰርሕን ኣብ ፀገም ወዲቕና ሰማዕሲእና ማለት
ብጠቕላላ ካብ ሓምለ 13 ዓመተ ምህረት ጀሚሩ ክሳብ ዝሕዚ ጥሮታ ዝወፃና ብመንግስቲ ሰራሕተኛ ከባቢ 75 ኣለና ኣብ ከተማ ኣክሱም ካብኣቶም ሓደ ኣነ እየ ስለዚ ኣነ ክሳብ ሕዚ ምንም ዓይነት መሃያ ዝተኸፈልኩዎ ነገር ኣይብለይን ማሕበራዊ ዋስትና እንትኸልኩ ጥሮታ ወፂኻ ብዝብል ደረጃ መሃያ ክፍሊ ትምህርቲ ስለ ዘይከፈለካ ክንሰርሕልካ ኣይንኽእልን ዝብል መልሲ ይወሃበኒ ኣብ ክፍሊ ትምህርቲ እንተኸልኩ ድማ ፈሰስ ኣይመፀና ናታትኩም የለኹም ተባሂልና ስለዚ ኣነ ኣብ ክልቲኡ ተንጠልጢለ ኣለኹ ማለት እዩ
ሕዚ ምስቲ ዕፅዋን ክባን ኣጋጣሚ ኮይኑ ኣብ 2014 ካብ ጉንበት ሓደ እየ ጥሮታ ወፅየ ስለዚ ካብ ጉንበት ሓደ ጥሮታ ወፅየ ሕዚ ግን ጥሮታ ይኸውን ስለ ዝተኣኸለ ደሞዘ ይኽፈለኩም ተባሂልና ፀኒዕና ሕዚ ተንጠልጢልና ወሃዊ ኢና ዘለና ከማና ዝበሉ ኣብ ካሊእ ሴክተራት ዝሰርሑ ዝተኸፈሎም እኒው
እቶም መምህራን ን40-30 ዓመታት ብምግልጋል ኣብ ክንዲ ሽልማት ክወሃበና أتي سرحنا اللورة هاتنا ونتخلكلنا خبلو مرارته ما سمعهم.
سلازي أربع عام.
Work is the essential one that you are an extension is here, but it is very important one. The second one is I think things. Now we have not only hundreds, thousands of mass graves in Tigray.
بتينا بروتيريا سمعنت زي تذكر مخان عدنا زي تملسنا بمخانو عندنا خاني اتي تسفافعنا يا محران نا إيرتران كوتس نا بروتيريا سمعنت عب تكبر سلا زي وعالة
أبزي خمسين كنا برين لندن أو عدنا كنا ملص حدشتي سافرتنا مسوكافتن كافتن عدنا
and restoring family is very important. Missing persons are thousands, and knowing where they are is very important. And understanding the mass graves is very important. The mass graves are of two types. There are military mass graves, those are skilled military persons.
بتينا بروتيريا سمعنت زي تذكر مخان عدنا زي تملسنا بمخانو عندنا خاني اتي تسفافعنا يا محران نا إيرتران كوتس نا بروتيريا سمعنت عب تكبر سلا زي وعالة
mass grave so that families can at least grieve and get relief so
ማእኸሉ ኣሜሪካ ዝገበረ ጀስቲስ ፎር ሂማኒቲስ ዝተባሃለ ትካል ኣብ ከተማ መቐለ ኣብ ዝተፈላለዩ ኣብያተ ትምህርቲ ተዓቂቦም ንዝርከቡ ተፈናቐልቲ ወገናት ናይ ምንጻፍ ሓገዝ ከም ዘበርከተ ተገሊጹ እቲ ድጋፍ ኣብ 5 ክፍለ ከተማታት ንዝርከቡ 450 ተመዛበልቲ ከም ዝተዋሃበ ኣብ ምሕዳር ከተማ መቐለ መተሓባበሪ ተመዛበልቲ ወገናት ዶክተር ሰለሞን ጸጋይ ገሊጾም
መሬትን ኣብ ሲሚንቶን ዝድቅስ ሰብ ብጣዕሚ ዘሕዝን ንሱ ምስራእና ኢሚዲየት ክንፈትሖ ኢልና ከባቢ 450 ዝኾኑ ጽጉማት ኣብ መሬትን ኣብ ሲሚንቶን ዝድቅሱ ቆልዑ ዝሓዛ ጥኑሳት ኣንስቲ ምስራእና
other financial and other issues may come, but they are secondary because we are working here financial rewards, but just to get the reality, to get the truth.
ማእኸሉ ኣሜሪካ ዝገበረ ጀስቲስ ፎር ሂማኒቲስ ዝተባሃለ ትካል ኣብ ከተማ መቐለ ኣብ ዝተፈላለዩ ኣብያተ ትምህርቲ ተዓቂቦም ንዝርከቡ ተፈናቐልቲ
For instance, last week we came across that school was to begin and the schools were to be repaired. But the people in the locality, the teachers began to raise, no, this shouldn't be repaired. This should be kept as museum, as a memory.
ተወለድቲ ጣብያ ኣብርሃ ዋጽባሃ ከባቢውን ኣብቲ ጣብያ ንዝርከቡ
so that students should get a place to learn.
ማእኸል ፎር ሂማኒቲስ ዝተባሃለ ትካል ኣብ ከተማ መቐለ ኣብ ዝተፈላለዩ ኣብያተ ትምህርቲ ተዓቂቦም ንዝርከቡ ተፈናቐልቲ ወገናት ናይ ምንጻፍ ሓገዝ ከም ዘበርከተ ተገሊጹ እቲ ድጋፍ ኣብ 5 ክፍለ ከተማታት ንዝርከቡ 450 ተመዛበልቲ ከም ዝተዋሃበ ኣብ ምሕዳር ከተማ መቐለ መተሓባበሪ ተመዛበልቲ ወገናት ዶክተር ሰለሞን ጸጋይ ገሊጾም
መሬትን ኣብ ሲሚንቶን ዝድቅስ ሰብ ብጣዕሚ ዘሕዝን ንሱ ምስራእና ኢሚዲየት ክንፈትሖ ኢልና ከባቢ 450 ዝኾኑ ጽጉማት ኣብ መሬትን ኣብ ሲሚንቶን ዝድቅሱ
2014 ጥረታወፂ ማለት እዩ 40 ዓመት
ዝተፈላለዩ ከባቢታትን ዘገልገሉ መምህራን እንትኾኑ ካብ 2014 ኣቆጻጽራ ግእዝ ግን ናይ ጥሮታ ዕድሚኦም መሊኡ ዝተሰናበቱ ዋላ እኳ እንተኾኑ እቲ ንዓመታት እቲ ዝለዓል ቅርታ ትኽክል ምዃኑን
for the role they have been playing towards the search for peace, resolution of the Tigray crisis that led to the resolution of the conflict in Pretoria.
I'm really impressed and so it may sound strange, but relieved to hear how much is being done in terms of documenting and organizing, and the fact that you said 37,000 volunteers to collect data.
ተወለድቲ ጣብያ ኣብርሃ ዋጽባሃ ከባቢውን ኣብቲ ጣብያ ንዝርከቡ ክልተ ቀዳማይ ብርኪ ኣብያተ ትምህርቲ ንዝርከቡ 1300 ተምሃሮ ናይ ትምህርቲ ናውቲ ሓገዛት ኣካይዶም
ብናውቲ ያው ብቲ ማሕበር ዘጠራቐሞ ተነሳሽነት ብዶክተር ካሕሰን
حدث أوت أزنبر أود ساعات يجينا برها تفتاوت جرزير زبالو بنا علم تبغسو محاورة عايشهم زبيت مرتنا إحنا ممكن نستوعب إحنا قبلنا لهم دفتر مولو لزبيت مرتي من دعك حاويسو
تولرتي تابع أبرها وعتبها كبابيون أبتي تابع نزركبو كلت قدامي بركي أبيات تمرتي نزركبو عشان سلستميتن تمهارو نايت مرتناوتي حاجزات أكايدوم
وبناوتي يا بتي محاور زطرعو متنهاشنة الجيب دكتور كحسن حدث أوت أزنبر أود ساعات يجينا برها تفتاوت جرزير زبالو بنا علم تبغسو محاورة عايشهم زبيت مرتنا إحنا ممكن نستوعب إحنا قبلنا لهم دفتر مولو لزبيت مرتي من دعك حاويسو طابع وراها خمس طابع خوين دخلنا البيت متذاكر ممهر حاجز تغير لهم له وزحي تجازى بدفتر شوعتش حكاوي لا جزء مسكينتو سلسلتي اساس
فكرتنا مرتي بزحات تمهارو عم عدت مرتي ماتو كنزلو تزاربو نفرق ولا هايلاي حاجز تمهارو تطلب من العالم ولكن تمهارو في حاجز عبوس كانت